consultant with extensive experience in facilitation, leadership development, and culture change and organizational assessments. No other than Miss Laura Buckley.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Miss Laura. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to, but thank you for that intro. You covered all the major bases there. So yeah, I started my career as an army officer and registered dietitian, and after about 8 years on active duty, I transitioned into leadership consulting and coaching. Uh, Primarily because what I realized as a dietitian is the spaces that we spend the most of our time in have such a major impact on our well-being and our ability to be consistent with healthy habits and things that make us feel well. And I just became deeply interested in the culture of organizations and the dynamics in the workplace and how we create really healthy spaces for people to be able to feel their best, do their best, and really thrive in the workplace.
Miss Laura Buckley, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about one of your favorite book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And what single concept from the book hit you hardest and why?
Yeah, I think the thing that really stood out for me, and I think that is so important in leadership in particular, is the first thing we think we know is our brain's quick answer. But it's when we think a little slower and more deeply and expand our perspective so that we have more information to work with, that's when we come up with better answers, better outcomes, more viable solutions, and more truth. You know,
Mm.
it's we our brain wants to operate really quickly. It's an efficient machine, right? It wants to have answers,
Yes.
it wants to jump right in, it wants to take what it sees and make the most of it. But it's when we say, okay, that's my first impression, that's my first understanding, but what might else I realize, or what might else I see or learn or take away? Where is the nuance, where is the gray that we can add to our understanding so that it's more whole and we're operating from a stronger foundation.
Strong foundation indeed, and very well said, Miss Laura. Beautifully articulated. And how did reading about cognitive biases you regularly exhibit change your self awareness?
The biggest thing is just slowing down. It's about, I am a very fast mover. So this, I think, probably why it meant so much to me is I like to move fast. I like to do a lot of things. I like to get a lot of things done. So for me, the self-awareness was, how quickly am I trying to make sense of this information and do something with it? Or how quickly am I trying to move through this work product or this agenda design or this leadership concept or this leadership model that I want to teach? It's about knowing that I want to jump into it quickly. But what I have actually changed most is letting it be quick at first, but not putting it out into the world. And then a couple days later, after my brain's had some time to think about it, sit with it, then going back and looking at it again and saying, okay, what is solid here? Where do we need to add depth? Where do we need to add space? Because when I think about leadership and when I think about the trends in how we lead, and in particular, how we meet, like how we gather our teams and how we spend our time together, I'm realizing how important it is to stop trying to move fast and do a lot and instead slow down, add more space for meaningful conversation, for more people to join the conversation, making sure that we're creating opportunities where everybody has a chance to participate. That really takes slowing down. That takes moving away from what we can jump into quickly and moving into more thoughtful, more intentional spaces. So that's probably what I'm thinking about the most in this moment as it relates to the book. I read the book a while ago, so it's interesting to think about, when you say thinking about books that changed something about how we see the world, how we operate, how we live, who we are. It's interesting to think about what has stayed with me over the long term, and that's that piece around really not trying to do as much, but creating space to do more deep and meaningful work.
Miss Laura, have you identified a past professional or personal mistake directly linked to a biases by Kahneman describes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is thinking about how quickly I've reacted in personal communication. One of the things I think about a lot right now is how we lead in relationship to other people. And being in relationship is all about communication, right? Everything we talk about
Yes.
in when it comes to leadership comes back to how we communicate with each other. And I think about some of the quick responses that I've had in difficult situations. And I, there's actually one communication. It was almost 20 years ago, and I still think about it, when I was a dietitian in the Army. And there was a challenge in one of our dining facilities. So, in the Army, dietitians have a big role in dining facility management, and um, there was rotten milk. So that was the issue. There was rotten milk in the dining facility, and I think about how quickly I noticed there was rotten milk, and then how really kind of harshly I spoke to the person who was responsible for it. And I think about that immediacy around what's okay to say, how it's okay to say it, and what negative impact it can have, and how much more positive impact we can have if we slow down. We say, okay, what else is going on here? Of course, we're all human. We're all living under certain pressures and certain responsibilities. Like, things will get missed. It happens. Is this really worth a quick response? Is this really, and honestly, the answer is probably no. Like, it's never worth a quick response, right? Like, it's always worth taking the time to think about how we're going to communicate about what's happening and get curious about what's going on for the other person. That's one of the things that I think about so much now, is in these difficult situations, or when a conversation has to be had, not just jumping in and leading with my perspective, but instead slowing down and saying, hey, what's going on for you? What got us here? What do we need to do differently moving forward? Right? Like, knowing that the more we lean in, slow down, so we can actually lead with curiosity, which was one of the things that I teach in my leadership training and coaching, is stop leading with what we think we know, and lead more with, what can I find out here? Like, how can I be more curious? How can I create stronger connection, so that we're moving in ways that really support that relationship and that trust?
Again, Miss Laura, very well said and empowering answer. How has the book influenced your decision making rituals, just like checklists or forced delays for high stakes choices?
Yes, that is a great question. Um, for me, the biggest thing is writing down what I think the answer is. And then again, it's kind of the same thing. I think the biggest takeaway is just the amount of adding space between what our first thought is and then what the final decision is going to be. So for me, it is not trying to control outcomes, but gathering information and letting it sit, and then seeing what other information might come in, what really feels right. I mean, this could be waiting a couple of days, but for me, sometimes if I'm trying to make an important decision, if I sit quietly, even for a good 5 to 10 minutes, my answer might change, right? It's doesn't always have to be a long time between when I'm presented with a decision and when I actually make it. But what's important is that it's not cluttered space. You know, it's different to say, oh, I need to make this decision. Now I'm going to go scroll social media for 10 minutes and then I'll make it. That's not going to make it any better. But if I sit quietly, if I, just kind of stare off out in front of my window, I have big trees across the road. So if I just kind of sit back, look into the distance, like just letting it slow down in my body before I try to jump in makes a really big difference for me. I also use journaling. Um, Sometimes I use pros and cons lists, but I'm more of a journaler or go for a walk or just try to create some quiet space.
Miss Laura, how can you, or since, how do you simplify Mr. Daniel Kahneman's frameworks to help clients recognize their irrational financial health choices?
They're what choices?
Irrational
Oh,
financial or health choices.
sure. Um, so when I think about working with clients and helping them use it to make choices, the first question I'll ask someone is like, what immediately feels like the right answer? And then we just say, what else? What else? What else? What else is possible? What else might it be? There's a really, I think, simple exercise you can do where one of the things he talks about is as we go about our day, or as we navigate our spaces, our brain automatically assigns meaning to everything we see, right? So I can't see a chair and not acknowledge it as a chair. Or I can't see a water bottle and not acknowledge it as a water bottle. Our brains are too quickly wired to have already made meaning about what things are. But there's a really simple exercise you can do. And I like to do it with like a hair tie because it's I always have one on me. So it's an easy thing for me to use. But
Yes.
I'll say to somebody, what is this? And then I say, okay, write down 10 other things it could be. Just make your brain come up with 10 other things, 15 other things. And it's like once your brain gets started, it's incredible to see like how many other things we could call it or do with it. Um, and then I kind of relate that back then to bigger picture things. Okay, so if this feels like the obvious answer, what else could it be? What else could it be? With health choices, I'm very interested in how people make choices related to their health. My focus now is on how we lead, but when it comes to making choices, so much of what we decide is based just on what we see the most of, or what we hear the most of, or what feels most popular, or what feels most common. The challenge is those things aren't always the thing that's going to work for you. Oftentimes they rarely are. They're just the easiest things to sell, right? So, you know, I work with people to say, okay, I get it. That might feel like the most obvious thing or the that feels like what's most prevalent on your brain. But think about what's really worked for you in the past. What's felt good for you in the past? How have you made decisions about this in the past that led to the kinds of results that you were hoping to see? How can we use more of that information to inform what we want to do moving forward versus seeing something that's very popular right now or very prominent or very mainstream? Let's go back to what's actually true for you based on what you know about yourself. And, we can be so influenced by what we see around us. And then we want to make decisions based on that. Again, that's that quick thinking piece of our brain. That's that thinking fast. But we can slow it down. We can think slowly and deeply and intentionally about it so that we make choices that really feel true for us, not just what's most common in our awareness right now.
Miss Laura, as a leadership development coach, what are your short term and long term goals?
My short-term goal, I always say is to connect with leaders who want to own their impact and have honest conversations about how to make it the best it can be. I've gotten to a point in my career where I really feel like if we're not having honest conversation, we're not going to move the needle. So it's how do we really connect with people who are like, I have an impact on other people. I want to make sure it's the best impact it can be because if I take great care of my people and my people are feeling good in their workplace, it will lead to better results for my business. Right? When people feel well, when people are having a good experience, they want to stay, they want to contribute at a high level, they want to take good care of the customer. And it's important for leaders to know that the higher they are in an organization, the greater they're impacting someone's experience in the workplace. So we got to own it, and then we got to have honest conversation about it, and that is what creates opportunity to really knock it out of the park.
Good luck to your goals, Miss Laura, and looking for more and more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be a coach?
Piece of advice for someone who wants to be a coach, and if you've gone through a good coaching program, you know this, but is to really trust clients' wisdom. Trust that people do have answers. They just need support thinking differently, accessing their own inner knowledge more effectively so that they can bring out the best in themselves. I think coaching, that's the method we, you learn as a coach, but it's also pretty easy to want to just like tell people and give advice and fall more into that consultant role. But I really do think the greatest impact comes when we empower people to listen to their own inner wisdom and trust yourself as a coach that you have the skills and the ability to do that.
Yes. Thank you for your advice, Miss Laura. And what real world problem, healthcare enrollment, retirement planning, or screams for a nudge based on Kahneman's work?
Sorry, can you ask that? Can you say that again?
What a real world problem that screams for nudge based on Kahneman's work?
Yeah. I think how we relate to each other. I think that's the biggest
Mm,
thing is how we
yes.
relate to each other, how we relate to people who have different perspectives from our own, how we can engage in that from a place of curiosity instead of competition. I think there's a lot of opportunity for connection there if we apply his work.
How does his willingness to challenge his own theories model intellectual integrity for you?
I think that's what leadership is all about. When I think about what it means to be a high integrity leader, it is about questioning our own work. It is about questioning our own theories. It's about asking things and saying, like, you know what? This is something that I really deeply believe in, and it's not perfect.
Yes.
How do we do it with that openness where we can feel confident? I think this is such a challenge as a leader is to feel confident in what you believe and how you lead while also staying open and flexible to the fact that it may not always be the right thing. It will change over time. The more we know, the more we'll see things differently. So I think the highest integrity leaders are the people who will say, all right, this is what we've been doing, this is what I think, these are my theories, these are my my competencies, but they might not always be right. And I might choose to do it differently down the line. And I need to leave space for that exploration, for new information, because I think it comes right back to what the book is about, which is we can get so solidified in our beliefs that we end up closing ourselves off to new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of working. I think about probably my biggest shift in that space was from the dietetics perspective was, I came into my career thinking and being trained that these are certain behavior habits that are, good for everybody. And this is what people need in order to be successful with their diet. And I operated in that way for many years, like weight loss was the goal. We all had to have certain healthy habits. Like that's what it meant to be healthy and well. But it became apparent to me over time that there is no one size fits all, that health outcomes aren't directly related to our weight and our body composition, that there's so much more to it. But it took time, and it took a lot of like self-reflection to really adopt new ways of working and new ways of coaching and supporting people that were outside of some of those initial models that I thought were true and really was trained on as best practice.
Again, a very well said, Miss Laura. Beautifully articulated. How has your interpretation of the book changed since the first reading it?
I think it's a really, really, I would say, dense book. There is a lot of information in there. There is a
Yes.
lot of, there's a lot of research and graphs, and there's a lot in there. I think for me, the biggest shift is just the simplification of it, is like just letting it not be so complex that it's hard to apply, and coming back to the basics of there are the two ways our brain wants to interpret, which of course there's a spectrum, but that, our brain wants to, kind of our lazy, quick thinking brain wants to go straight to these fast, obvious face value answers. And if we slow it down and allow our slower thinking brain to come in to gather information, then we have a lot better opportunity. I know the book is way more complex than that, but when I think about the long-term impact that it's had on how I kind of thought about it over time, it really is that place around just slow down, make more space, entertain, broader, deeper perspective, and you'll do things differently. It'll change how you relate to the world.
Yes, indeed. Before we wrap up our discussion, Miss Laura, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in its fifth season as well. Geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast Law 101 and Mental Health 101. Love Letters in its third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in its fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. Miss Laura, what's the first mental habit from thinking fast and slow you'd urge everyone to adopt tomorrow?
Before you take anything at face value, ask one question about it.
Yes.
One question. It
Ask
all starts with
one
asking
question.
one question.
One question indeed. Am I the right person to this job? Now, Miss Laura Buckley, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy or any projects that you're doing right now?
Yeah, come check me out at laurabuckleycoaching.com. I send a newsletter twice a month with ideas, thoughts, perspectives on how we can lead with better personal impact. And I'd love to have you over there if you're an honest leader who likes to kind of hear sometimes the hard truths and think about things in a deeper perspective.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Laura Buckley, because if you support her, more and more and more empowering leaders for our future generations to come. So, Miss Laura, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
More to come, people. See you soon.